Hey, Courtney, who's today's episode supported by?
Colossal.
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 Colossal. Anyway, this episode is supported by Colossal, a brand new way to discover beats online. Colossal isn't live yet, but we've had an early preview and we're excited to tell you about it. Colossal lets artists gain exclusive access to beats from top industry producers. These are beats that are usually only reserved for major artists, and they're partnering with new producers every day. The Colossal app is the fastest way for artists to find beats that they love and make their best music. The app has a killer feature called Rives, which is a totally new take on beat discovery. Just describe the kind of beats you're looking for, and Rives gives you a personalized feed to scroll through, just like TikTok. We all know browsing on YouTube for beats can be a pain. Colossal also has simple licensing options, giving independent artists full ownership of songs they make with no complicated terms or restrictions. We'll tell you more about Colossal soon, but if you're a producer and interested in getting involved, check the link in the video description to get in touch with the Colossal team. Now, on to your episode.
Take. His hand is getting in the way, and it's still just perfect.
And it's perfect. He's rolling, bro. Like we see that all the time. But
of course.
Nonetheless,
shout out to the engineers on TV.
Yes, we're talking about engineers on TV. If you're like completely lost in the whole nine, we just kind of got into it. But nonetheless, when you see us in a different room, you can already assume that we are having a special guest. I will be honest with you. I think this guest has probably one of the most prestigious titles that we've ever had on this podcast. Absolutely. By the way, it was a little intimidating. But nonetheless, I got so many questions for him and things of that nature. But let me introduce this podcast. Please make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. Also, remember, one lucky person in the comment section is going to get that VIP Gold Edition Rosetta EQ or compressor. And also remember that our members saw this video completely before you. You get money in the store and a bunch of other goodies, especially early releases on videos. It's just exclusive content. My name is Devvon Terrell. I'm a Pro Tools user. Let's go. Should I go right?
Go to the left.
Wow, you're right. It is left. It's still left. I'm sorry. Go to the left of me.
I'm the left of you?
I mean,
and now the orientation.
If I turn this, that's why I said he's kind of left, like left adjacent.
I'm LJ, the FL guru.
Got you. Yes. To the right of me.
And over here is Courtney T, 12. You already know.
Appreciate you.
Ableton 12.
Ableton 12.
All the time.
And today we have a very special guest.
Esteemed.
And man, I just want to get going. The guest we have today is the director of audio engineering of Universal Music Group. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Nick Rives. Make some noise. Dude, we don't, as audio professionals, even think about these things. We all think about, I record, I'm a recording engineer, I'm a mixing engineer, things of that nature. But we don't realize with these, huge platforms and companies and stuff like that, that there are professionals behind it, you know what I mean, that kind of lead the charge and are in charge of stuff like that. What we like to ask everyone when they first come on is, what was your DAW journey? So what was the first DAW you started in and where are you now?
Or game or board.
Right.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the very first would have been, remember those integrated units? I had a Foztex
oh my gosh,
MR8 or whatever, right? Which was, and the big deal with that was now recording to compact flash.
Right.
It wasn't a cassette or something like that.
Right.
Right. And it was like that and the Sennheiser version of a 58. So
gotcha.
8835 or something like that. And then just, I was, 3-piece garage band in San Francisco, recording in the basement, it expanded to, mixer into that because it was 2-channel, but you could overdub on it. And stuff like that. And then I remember it's okay, I'm going to get a computer involved. You know what I mean? I was it seems like that's the way to go, right? And so then it was, I messed around with a couple of things by it was a really early version of Audacity and this thing called by Magix, who do all that mastering software.
Yeah.
But I was I didn't know what I was doing, so I was just figuring stuff out. And then it was an early Cubase.
Okay.
Nice.
And then almost immediately Pro Tools 5. With the M-Box, the vertical one with the baby blue face.
We literally just had a conversation.
I was
putting them on, they was I don't know what that is. Like I showed him a picture today. It was like, what is this
was like,
thing?
it's not an Atmos.
Yeah. But it wasn't it like a revolutionary piece for like at home?
Because all of a sudden I'm at home, you know, on this like giant CRT monitor looking at Pro Tools, which was like hurt your eyes at the time.
Burning.
You know, I mean, it was just so flat and beige and just, you know, not creative feeling at all. And but there I was. I could plug in 2 microphones, or I could plug in the left right of a mixer into it, which you know immediately you like overcome those limitations. Right. It's like, this box can do 5 things. I'm going to make it do 7 things. You know. Right. And so I was doing that, but then once I was in Pro Tools, it was kind of Pro Tools all the way, and then it was like the Digi 003. You know, right. Yeah, exactly. You know, and then the little extra ADAT 8 channels. So you know, now I've got 16.
Right.
You know, now I get, you know what I mean? It's like
one of the most natural progressions I've ever seen. Like,
you know,
that was such a natural progression. Yeah.
And it was Pro Tools from then on out. I remember when it went to Pro Tools 8, and all of a sudden it was like all of the, you know, Pro Tools, right? It's all of these features we've had in these other DAWs, and then all of a sudden they do it, but then they do it in a way that's kind of elegant. You know? Right. And so it's like, okay, they catch up, but then they do it in a meaningful way, and I always appreciated that. And I just stuck with it because it was what I was seeing in studios and stuff. And I've always taken the kind of classical approach of a recording and mixing engineer, right? Like I don't particularly compose. I mean, you know, I'm a bass player. I know my way around the keyboard, drum set, things like that. But I wasn't like composing in the platform, right? So it was always about working with people who were doing that, right? Working with somebody on eventually Ableton and Fruity Loops and you know, Logic, people who are like producing and creating. And I was recording, right? I was like, you know, it's time to put a drum set on this. Cool. Like, here I come with my little case of microphones, like my little drum kit stuff,
classic,
and, you know, like all of that, and then it just grew and grew and grew.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that was always the way I related to the work. So it was always going to be Pro Tools and like as many different inputs as I could do, because I wanted to be able to show up to like your show, and, like take a 1-to-1 off the front of the house desk or something like that. Like
and
it was always that kind of thing. You know? So my little rack, my little SKB rack, and you know.
So you got like a rack, like your whole rack and everything, like ready to go.
That was my thing for a long time. You know, like high school into college, like that was what I was doing at that, you know, for all of that sort of stuff, and then it kind of grew from there. You know? Well, and then I had opportunities to then start working in studios where then it's not about your rig anymore and it's just about your skills. And so that, which is a super meaningful transition. You know, and it's like, it also is a moment where you're like, okay, a lot of those skills you've been working on are much less relevant because you're in an institution with resources and the room. You're not fighting the room anymore. You're not, you know, so it's that kind of
like progression. I think it's funny saying that, like going from kind of like a run and gun kind of like lifestyle with the, you know, with set capturing sound to kind of like this controlled environment, and how that's a really big transition. Like even though you may say to yourself like, okay, now I'm in the studio, this should get easier, right? Like wink, wink, right? But it doesn't. What were some of like the woes in that transition where it was like, like whether you had to unlearn something or whether you had to say, I could do it this way? Like what was some of like those transitions like?
I think for me it was because you're in that setting, now it's a little bit of a different relationship between you and the people who are working around you. So I think immediately I had to figure out, you know, it's like you can learn a lot about, you know, the different microphones, where to point them, how to operate the desk, what it means to have all of these great resources and all that like cool sexy stuff that we love about studios. But what does it mean to be in the room? You know what I mean? What does it mean to like be on the talkback mic now? Because it's not me in the corner on my headphones being like, you know, it's like, you know, now we're communication and, you know, curating a vibe, but even like, what does that even mean, right? Like being the type of attitude that can, you know, you might be with one group one day and then a different group a different day, and the atmosphere is totally different, but you're still the person in the room. How do you do that, right? Like how do you know? And so I think for me it was a lot of learning and unlearning things that weren't immediately technical necessarily. It's like I knew my way around Pro Tools. So, you know, I knew fader up is louder, you know, gain, you know, certain things like that. Of course, you hone those over time, and every time you work, you get better, hopefully. But what does it mean to be in the room? Like, what does it mean to work with people? What is it, you know, especially when, you know, because artists, they're so vulnerable when they're in the studio, but in the best possible way, you know? And so you need to be able to nurture whatever that energy is, you know? And today's energy might be different than yesterday's energy, or whatever's going on can affect the mindset. And yet there's an expectation that you're going to deliver as an artist. And so it's like, how do you know, at the end of the day, I could have the best microphones, the best gear, the best space, but if they're not feeling it, you can't manufacture charisma. You know what I mean? Like, we can tune, we can make things sound brilliant, we have all these great insights and all of this technological prowess, but we can't make it something that I then believe. Right? So it's like, okay, now how do I not get in the way of that? You know, and some artists, they don't need anything at all, and some artists, you know, a little back and forth, a little conversation about what we're having for lunch, whatever it is, you know what I mean? Even if it's taking them out of the moment, you know? So it immediately became clear to me that there's a lot going on here that isn't the things that we think about when we're on the way there, you know? And so it's like, how do I step back and internalize those things without slowing my momentum either? You know?
How do you make that process seamless for them as well as just being effective in the room? You know, like adding to the ambiance of the room. That's really, really interesting. So obviously, you know, when you transition from that, was there a specific studio that when you started working and stuff like that, like kind of in this transition?
So I had some pretty lucky moments along the way. You know, in high school I had an opportunity to intern at a recording studio that was tape based, and that was their appeal. It was like, we're a tape studio in the Bay Area. It was OTR Studios with Cookie Marenko, and she's like the owner and operator of the studio and the facility and the engineer. And so immediately, you know, and I'm there to open and close the door between takes and like go get the food, you know. But I get to listen. I get to have my eyes open. I get to have my ears open, you know, and it's, you know, so you sponge up, right? You know, you do what you got to do, you know. And that was a great kind of beginning of understanding the experience and the place. But I still had a lot of things I needed to do on my personal journey as well. So like going to college, which I always wanted to do. I always understood that was, you know, where that fit into the world of pro audio and engineering and music making is elective. But I knew that was something that I wanted to do. So I went to Monterey State and I did, you know, a recording discipline.
Exactly.
And at that time, you know, there's like a way you're supposed to do your classes, and I totally didn't get that counseling, and so I like finished my program in the first like 2 years, and then the second 2 years I had to like go and take like physics and literature and all those other things. The core classes. So for that I became the TA for the music department, which had a relatively reasonable studio. So it's like, okay, cool, I'm TAing for the classes, but then I'm also in charge of taking care of the studio. And so now it's like, cool, just say yes to everything. Every college, every like campus band, everyone around, everyone's, you know, someone's doing opera and they're got to record their final piece or whatever. It's like, cool, yes, 100% yes, whatever. We'll do it at night. We'll do it off book, whatever. We'll just do the thing, right? Because I'm logging hours. You know, it's your 10,000 hours,
and just learning, trying,
testing, and exposure. And it's like I'd ever put a microphone on an opera singer before, right? And then you immediately realize, okay, well that's not what it sounds like right here. You know, that's what it sounds like way over there. So it's like, okay, you know, little kernels and stuff. So I'd been in the studio, and so I wanted to try to at least take some of that with me and you know and try to like reflect on those experiences. And then it was actually not so long after that I moved to LA and I had an opportunity to become a runner at Capitol Studios. Old school legacy
classic
studio, right? So you're grinding.
You're absolutely.
There's no is not in your vocabulary, you know, and it's like whatever you're doing, you're making coffee, you're hanging microphones, you're sitting in the back of the, you know, you're not expressing your opinion unless directly asked. And even then, you're diplomatic about it, you know, and you're like, which of these takes you like more? Well, they're both great, but you know, but this one, you know, and then you make a little observation and then you keep going, right? So it was like, so I had this kind of long and sort of uncharacteristically of the modern age traditional trajectory, right? And this was like 10 years ago. You know? So I moved to LA in January of 2013. And just followed that arc ever since.
And just kind of led you to this place right here.
Now,
when it comes to being, you know, which to be honest, I can't believe I never thought about like, you know, UMG having like a director of just straight up audio engineering. As far as, and I feel embarrassed to say that, by the way, because it's like, duh.
No, I think
but,
me too.
You know, what does that gig entail as far as what you are the director of, as far as things? I can't imagine like what that is.
I'll let you know when I figure that out.
Okay. And that tells me everything.
You know, I mean, it's an interesting question. So a little bit about how I got there was right place, right time at Capitol for the exploration of immersive audio.
Gotcha.
Right. we built with Dolby and at Capitol Studios and our primary mixing space, Studio C. We outfitted with a Dolby came to us and were like, we've got this thing. We've been making movies, occasionally TV shows.
Right.
We're curious about the relationship it could have with music, and so this is where they came to us.
Wow.
Right? And so cool.
Right.
At this point, I'm a staff engineer there.
Okay.
And it's not like light switch now. This is some full time thing we do.
Right. Yeah.
But we built the room. We work a lot with PMC.
Gotcha.
They're incredibly
Amazing.
great partners,
Yes.
and everyone's very personal about their speakers. But one thing is pretty recognizable about their speakers is they make a really great image.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
It's like the stereo in a stereo pair. They just jump so much wider than just the two speakers sitting there.
Right.
And so if we're gonna wrap the room, that seems like a pretty reasonable place to start.
Gotcha.
Right.
Yeah.
And they had some good opportunity. They were already thinking about this, so they had some boxes that could go in the walls and all of these really kind of sexy. Not like now we're not sitting in this giant array of speakers.
That is
They-
huge.
it's really
Okay.
It's a lot, right?
Right.
So we all worked together and made this 916 monitoring system in that space, and then it was like they kind of just handed us the keys to this technology, and then it's like, okay, figure it out.
Right.
And so I'm not saying I did this by myself at all, right? Like,
Of course.
Steve Janowick, our lead engineer, my colleagues, Jeff Fitzpatrick, Chandler Harrod,
Right.
we're like, okay, cool. Here's this new thing. You know how it is. You're always thirsty with new technology.
Yeah.
It's like, let's dig into it. Let's figure it out. Let's see
Can't
what
wait to
this
try it
thing
out
is all
type thing.
about.
Right, right.
And there were no rules. There was no end point. There were no, it was like this kind of existed in one space and one time, which
Right.
on the one hand is like, yeah, you could ask yourself a million questions about that.
Sure.
But on the other hand, you could be like, this is my cool little playground and nothing matters. I can
Right.
just have fun.
Right.
You know?
And create.
So in this, I guess, exploration of immersive audio in general, was there ever a conversation of the Sony immersive Sony 360?
360?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there was.
An
So there was,
adoption, because I
okay.
can imagine a lot of formats of immersive isn't the most what's the best word to put it, like convenient thing.
Oh,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Mixing
Well,
in 50 different versions of immersive.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
yes, 100%. Right? And it factored into a lot of different elements of the way we were doing that exploration. Like, for example, there was also this thing called Oro 3D that was happening in Europe, and it had a different requirement for the overheads. So our chief engineer at the time, Art Kelm, he put our overheads on trusses that were on wheels. So we basically created different tuning. So it was like if you were doing Oro 3D or you were doing Atmos, you could reposition the speakers.
Right.
So we did it and we shot that out and we tuned it and we were ready and we never once even looked at Oro 3D. Like it just never came across our desk. You know?
Right.
It just didn't happen.
Right.
360 did, but it didn't have those requirements, so we could use our Atmos rig to do it. You know, and we were we were still a big legacy analog studio. We still had, people coming in doing score mixes and Al Schmidt doing big mixes on the Neve and stuff. And so it was like we needed to be able to, like, at the push of a button, go back to classic legacy, whatever.
Right,
So there were it was a very over-engineered space compared to what you actually need to do the dig, do the gig. But but way long-winded story for no reason.
We loved it, because I was going to tell you something. When you just mentioned, for instance, because we visited, a few of the UMG locations. Like I remember the one in New York City. I believe it's on. I forgot where exactly, but it was the first time in an immersive room where I seen the speakers in the walls, and I was so confused. Remember, we was there, and I was just like. He was like, oh, well, this is our, shout out Duro, by the way, our guy. Oh, yeah. He was like, this one of our immersive rooms. And I was like, where's the speakers?
Yeah.
I was like, what you playing? Like, you joking? And then he was like, no, they're in the walls. And I was like, no. I was like, no way. Like, that was my early introduction to it. And I didn't know that was even possible. So when you said that, and now knowing, like, you were kind of like a part of that conception of that entire, like, you know what I mean? For early on.
Sure.
Like, what, obviously I know why. Cosmetically, it just looks better and stuff. But, like, from a scientific standpoint, like putting it behind that particular material and stuff like that for that sound, like what's that process? Because obviously it does kind of, I guess you could say, maybe alter the sound behind that material.
Well, but I mean, it's not that different from like in a theatrical situation where you're firing through a projection screen. Right?
Gotcha.
So it's like the material has an acoustic profile, and you just compensate for it in the tuning.
Gotcha.
Right? There's like a measurable, you shoot pink through it and measure the other side, and and you identify that delta and then compensate for it in the tuning.
Understood.
Right? So of course that means you need a front end that can tune at that level. Right. And there were a couple of different options for that. What was interesting was there was an immediate benefit to it that we didn't ever even recognize because we didn't understand the technology.
Right.
Yeah.
We put them behind the fabric because we didn't want to be super invasive in the space.
Right.
Right. We didn't want to be like you're looking at 20 speakers and it's like you're in there in stereo and it's like what is all of this?
Right.
You know?
Right.
But then when it cuts to like how Atmos actually works with object-based mixing, the speakers are only relevant to the space you're in the moment.
Right.
So if you can't see them, you're not going to think about them as these hard locations. You're just going to think about the relative positions of the sounds and the instruments and voices as you curate your immersive image.
Right.
So it actually immediately became this really attractive thing for actually doing that work.
Right.
Because you're not bogged down by what your eyes are telling you.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's so easy to mix with your eyes sometimes.
Always.
And well, when you're in stereo, you're always facing forward anyway. And so it's the screen that's maybe being that distraction at times. Not all the time. We all love, the feedback we get from all of that. But when you're looking and I'm like, I want the sound in that speaker, a more maybe evolved way to think about that when it comes to object-based mixing is I want to hear that sound there.
Right.
Right? And if there's a speaker there or not,
Right.
because that might be where my speaker is, but it might not be where yours is.
Yeah.
It might not be where yours is. We might have 4 totally different Atmos setups, right? But that position is objective to the virtual image.
Right.
So we have this opportunity then to maybe divorce ourselves of unnecessary visual stimuli in that moment.
Right. Because I would sit there, I'll be honest with you, I'll sit there like when I'm in it and I'll be like, I want to hear the synth there and there. Like in those 2 speakers. Like I'm specifically pointing to 2 spots. But when I was in there, I feel like I enjoyed the experience a little bit more because I was like, I'm not looking at the speakers. You know what I mean? I was just kind of like, like it's around. And I feel like I was more immersed into it, no pun intended, like into the entire setting. So obviously that was not saying a mistake, but that was kind of like just a secondhand, like, that actually works in our favor and stuff like that with it.
Yeah. Totally.
In the PMCs, I'll say this. There's one room you have the biggest speakers I've ever seen in my life. These PMCs were nuts. And I remember, shout out Duro again, he took us downstairs to listen to some mixes, and it was the cleanest, like widest, like big. It was so, and it wasn't a huge room, by the way, but it just didn't hurt. It was so loud, like it was so loud that I was scared, and I was like, but it feels fine, like because it would just hit. It was just so loud, but it's so clean though.
Totally, no distortion.
What made you? See, I was gonna say, what made you guys go with the PMCs and stuff like that in that regard?
So we'd been working with PMC before we got into the Atmos game.
Gotcha.
And we were, big legacy studio, and we had they weren't actually Augsburgers, but they were like similar designed, main monitors in the big main rooms, right? So 2 15s and a compression horn. Okay. And they were just getting long in the tooth. And it was time to like explore what we wanted to do for moving forward, right? And that studio, it's like you're doing a lot of scoring dates for TV and film, you're doing a lot of bands, you're doing live broadcast stuff. I mean, it's like everything
under the sun.
And we're talking to PMC, and shout out to Maurice Batiste, who runs the American side of the London-based company, but the American side of that. And what was so incredible about them right out the gate is, of course, like we have this big lexicon of or Rolodex of engineers. So we ask them, I mean, what are you going to do when you got a revolving door of talent coming through your studio all the time?
That's true.
Is you're going to ask them what they think,
right?
You know what I mean?
Like
and
survey,
and you just collect information, right? And we were noticing some trends on the PMC thing, and then when we start talking to them, what I think is going to sound like I'm something for PMC, and I have done a lot of work with them, so full disclosure.
All good.
But they really. Yes, they make great product, but really I think where they shine is their willingness to work with you on your needs.
Gotcha.
Right? What room do you have? Like you might be thinking like, I want this huge set of speakers, and they're like, well, you might not actually need that in your room for these reasons, but like let's try both. Let's see what we got. Right. So all of a sudden you're having these really like nuanced conversations that are really just about making sure you can do what you want to do.
Right.
And this led, that immediately spoke to us in this way where it's like we can have this conversation.
Right.
Now granted, this is a while ago, so I wasn't having this conversation. I was just in the room, paying attention, right? So I can't take credit for any of it.
Of course, understood.
But this is how I understand it to have gone, and then what it has evolved to become.
Right.
And we put in those, which might be the ones you're talking about, the QB1s, which are like the 410s with the mid and the tweeter.
Yes.
And then their whole thing is they're porting technology. They call it acoustic transmission line, or ATL. But it's which lets it speak to a bigger footprint than the physical device actually
Okay.
has, and it's it's all about time alignment and physics. Some of their people come from Formula One, which is kind of cool. Some of the people who designed that, they were like aerodynamicists on
my
cars.
gosh.
Yeah, so it's like hardcore math,
Right.
but a bunch of people who just like really love music,
Right.
and
Right.
they're just like we're putting that heart and that science together
Right.
in a way that I think is really cool. And it's like, look, there are other great speakers out
Sure,
there. We all
of
know
course.
this,
Right,
right?
right,
They're
right,
ama-
right.
But
Right.
all of that was just appealing to our sensibilities, and
Right.
and so it was like this is a good fit,
Right.
And then we did that project, and we're like, this is a great fit,
Right.
Like now we're sitting pretty because it's the big studio thing. You got your bigs that you don't change because they're mounted into the building.
Yes.
They're like weight bearing at this point,
Right.
And then you got whatever you're putting on the desk, right? And
Right.
it's tens. ATCs,
Right.
atoms, whatever you got, right?
Right,
Whatever
right.
you want. No wrong answers, right?
Right.
But when you go to the bigs, you want a pretty reliable situation,
Right.
And they just delivered on that. So we were already like really happy with the work that they were doing.
Right.
And so when it came to the conversation about Atmos, it's like, well, we need like 20 speakers in the room.
Right.
So we did a 916, which we thought was appropriate for the space. 6 overhead, the 9s are the wides, and of course the 7s and the rears, and the LCR and some subs.
Gotcha.
And it was just the right fit. I mean, it just, now Studio C has a reputation of just being a good sounding room, and it's that art and science and magic and thing that happens in a room. Some rooms just sound good.
Right.
And we were very lucky to have one of those rooms.
Sure.
And so we were starting from a very good palette.
Right.
And it just fit and it just sang. And honestly, I think that was a big part of why we were able to have so many kind of inspirational experiences with Atmos early on was because the system just sounded really good.
Right.
And it's
Right.
like,
It
it's
inspired
like
you.
when stuff sounds good, it sounds good.
Right.
And that's
Absolutely.
exciting.
Right.
That's engaging, So even if we like didn't know what we're doing and we're flying stuff around and we're just and breaking a lot of eggs trying to figure out how to make an omelet, our palette sounded good,
Right.
And that I think was a really great
kind of
starting.
Yes.
for
So
y'all.
we got all these great ingredients at this point,
Right.
Absolutely, yeah.
And and then I think one of the other things about that time was that revolving door of talent, right?
Yes.
We were very open door. I learned this from Al Schmidt, who was my
Love Al. Gotcha. Yeah.
You
I watch a lot.
He
of
always
content.
had the door open.
Gotcha.
Always. He always knew what he was doing. And he also, I love this about him, he would just walk in the room. Whatever you were doing in A and B, like he might be mixing in C or he'd be tracking in A. He'd get bored and he'd be like, all right, I'm going into B. See what's
what's
guys are
happening.
doing.
Yeah.
What's
Right.
going on over here?
Right.
And it's like it's Al
crazy.
Schmidt. He's legend. I mean,
Yes.
this guy did Sam Cooke. You're like, what are you going to do? Kick him out?
Yeah, no.
Whatever you're doing is more important
Yeah,
than him
no.
being in the room. So and I think he knew that, but he was he's the nicest guy of all time.
That's
He was
awesome.
the
Yeah,
nicest guy
for
of all
sure.
time. So but we adopted that, and so there was a period of time where it was like, oh, Nick's over across the hall messing around with that thing. Like, let's go see what he's doing. And it was, so you would get artists or engineers or producers coming in the room and like listening to it and hearing it. And I'd be like, what do you think of this? And I would just like do something and get some interesting feedback about it. Or I'd play him something, so it's like you're not, how it is in the studio. So when you're the engineer, you're often the only engineer in the room because you're the engineer.
Right.
So you don't always get that feedback. We're often very siloed because of
Yeah,
that,
exactly.
which is why it's so great.
That's true.
You all have these conversations all the time, which is super cool because it breaks down that barrier.
Right.
But often when you're in the room, the other person isn't because you're in the room.
Right, right. Ironically, as you're saying this, I'm like, it's crazy because a lot of us, I never even asked myself the question of, well, how did Atmos kind of like make its way in, or how did they start like kind of even getting in studios and stuff like that, and like how did the technology grow? Because one thing that we have a conversation on this podcast a lot is we say to ourselves, okay, we think about like the history of just kind of like speakers and things of that nature, just listening environments. We say, okay, well, things were in mono, things were in one speaker. Then we say, then it grew to stereo, and the mixes, ironically, we brung it up, are funny. Like I'll see, I've heard Ray Charles mixes where his piano is on the left and then his vocals on the right.
Yeah.
And we were trying to figure it out.
Yeah,
So,
Jackson
like,
5, I Want You Back.
Yes.
Got
Oh,
right.
my goodness.
LCR mix.
Right. Yeah.
It's hard.
So in that regard, and you saying like we know we was playing around, what would you say is some of the things that were being done in Atmos when it was like fresh and new, and how it's transitioned to like, hey, this is starting to become like kind of like a standard like for us and stuff like that? Like what were some of the, I don't want to say mistakes, like because I feel like it's music, you do what you want, but some of the things that's like, we kind of do this now, like instead, like we're starting to get a
Things they
standard.
learn
So-
from.
I mean, we're still learning that every day. And that's a big part of my job now, is to understand what people are doing.
Yeah.
right? We've unleashed this technology on the
Right.
world, and a lot of people didn't ask for it, and so it's like, well, how are they reacting to it, right? But to answer your question, like, we were always having that conversation a lot too, early stereo, right? And there was also this like there was often like a kind of a violent neglect to stereo too, right? In the same way that the conversation was like, well, who has 20 speakers and all of that sort of thing. It was like there was a time when it was like, well, who has 2 speakers?
Interesting.
Like what do and so you hear these stories about they cut the record in mono, the mixes are done, and they go home, and the assistant makes the stereo mix, right? And there's this sort of, and that's not to say neglect, because that's not fair. No one's offhand or negative about any of this sort of thing, but it's kind of like, yeah, all right, whatever. We got, they say make the stereo, so make the stereo, and you put the piano on the left, and you put the bass on the right,
and call it a day.
And look, it's stereo, and it's
crazy.
Obviously stereo,
right?
Yeah. So there's no mistaking that this is the stereo mix,
right?
So. So we're aware of that. We're also, you try to pay attention to and we're probably all of us guilty of this. New technology comes out and you immediately abuse it.
I was going to say, just overdo it. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Or break it or do things, and so you do, you'll be doing some like nice sensitive ballad and you've got some synth like flying around the room with that crazy automation and you're like, yeah, that's dope. And then you come in the next morning and you're like, that is so lame. Like, I got lost in the sauce. You know what I mean? I flew too close to the sun. It's just, it's in our nature.
Right.
But that's how we learn not to do that again.
Right.
Or at least think more critically about when we do that the next time, right? And so, and of course that evolves into when is or isn't that type of thing appropriate. And so what I always say about that when what I developed anyway, I guess, as my relationship to the technology in the space is, no amount of technology ever supersedes the art and the storytelling and the nature, right? I mean, we may put on records and listen to them because of the way they sound. Most people don't. They listen to them because it resonates with them, or it makes them want to dance, or it makes them want to cry, or whatever it is, right? So, so when you're deciding how am I going to how is this mix going to have purpose in the immersive space? Right. It's like, well, man, first I'm just to listen to that piece of music, right? And it's like, what am I meant to feel? Is it intimacy? Right. Or is it escapism, right? Is this a Tiesto track and it's like laser beams and fireworks and it's like, okay, cool. Well, in that case, I have a huge palette of tools that I can use to
make it happen.
Yeah, make that happen. Bring that out into space. But if it's a ballad about heartbreak, it's like, well, man, I want to literally bathe in that feeling, right?
Understood.
It's like that. It's at night and I've got my headphones on and I'm just like feeling it.
And
it's like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Maybe I can make that happen in this space.
Gotcha.
And maybe that's the use of negative space, right? Maybe it's not filling all the speakers, right?
That's intentional.
But exactly, right? So it's like
a good way to put it.
The immersive space is just another canvas. It has more opportunities for certain things, but it doesn't necessarily make the music more compelling.
Understood.
Or it doesn't make the song better. It just gives you a different way to relate to it.
Get you.
And there may be some types of music where that opportunity goes a lot further.
Right.
Like the dance music or the pop music.
Right. Where you can
things
go a
that
little
hit
crazier.
really hard. Yeah, or people who really orchestrate, right? And you got all these little textures and when you put stuff in your mix and it's like this is meant to be felt, not heard.
Not heard.
Yes. Or I'm putting the B in subtle. All those ways we like to kind of play with sound.
Right.
Like, okay, now we really have something we can do with that.
I noticed one thing I'll say is when it comes to immersive, like when I was first hearing it, and I'll literally say like maybe 2-3 years ago, it was like a NAMM when we first started kind of getting into it. 2-3 years ago, I remember like someone played a mix and it was crazy. It was wild. It was like shooting all over the place. And then shout out to our guy Blue at Republic.
Oh, for sure.
One of the engineers. Love Blue to death. And I remember I started to hear more Atmos mixes like in actual studio settings. And I started to realize I feel like everyone's kind of dumbing it down, kind of just opening things up and kind of like I started to see a different style of Atmos, as opposed to when I first was hearing it 2 years ago to now. Like I was like, oh, it's starting to change. We're starting to see like a common thread.
Almost like a simplified kind of style.
It got way simpler. I would see a few records where I was like, okay, I'm still getting like a moment of, this is immersive, just letting you know. And then sometime I would get those records that were like super just like opened. Like it was just dead. Like nothing crazy was going on, but it was just super open. I'll say this, from the artist, do you get notes from the artist with immersive where they're like, hey, just open it up? Like I'm trying to think about even what
Or
notes
even
would
like
I
I'm trying to put this here kind of thing.
Yeah, or like, is the artist getting better at communicating their goals in Atmos these days?
I think where we are right now, yes, and yes.
Okay.
There's so many things I want to talk about related to everything you just said. And it's so perfectly on point for where we are right now. In the this is still a brand new discipline compared to the making records, right? But so where do I even begin? I think zooming out a little bit, how engaged artists are with the experience is where it starts. Right. Like, are they doing an Atmos record because they themselves are inspired to, because they understand what the experience can be and they want to explore that creatively? Or are they doing it because they want to participate in this thing that's happening, but maybe they aren't thinking that way? They wrote their record in stereo. They've always ever thought about things in stereo. And it's like, think about the ways in which stereo as a format informs your writing, right? Rock music, you take a guitar, cool, I'm going to pan it hard left, I'm going to double it, I'm going to pan it hard right. That is a function of stereo. You're making a compositional decision based on the format.
You're right.
If you were in mono, you might not make that decision.
That is so true.
Absolutely.
Right.
So stereo is in the very DNA of the way we write music, because we're generations into that being the way we relate to the craft.
I never, I'm sorry that we all like, because you're right. Like, we're not making music with that in mind for the most part.
And it's even true because even a couple months ago when we had that episode and we were talking about how a lot of the YouTube producers that are like kind of like showing other producers how these industry producers kind of get their style. And I told you, Loner, him and a lot of other YouTube producers are kind of getting into that space of, I'm gonna mono out this sound and then affect the mono signal to give it a better sense of space within the entire stereo space.
I remember you
and I'm
you
thinking
talking
about that now. I was like, if we didn't have stereo, we wouldn't have even thought of that.
He wouldn't even have done that. So in my head, it's like, for instance, obviously you've actually yourself obviously done a lot of immersive mixes. Some in particular I've seen, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of Billie Eilish stuff that you've done immersive stuff in.
I did the first 3 records.
The first 3 records.
Not the newest one.
Gotcha.
But I did the first 3 records.
And when you mention, like the ballads and stuff like that, obviously that's a very unique vocal. Like that like obviously she's...
Especially with Billie,
Yeah. When, for instance, those stems get sent to you, like what is that process, right? Like, are you the person, like, because I've heard all kinds of schools of thought like on that type of stuff, like how is Billie Eilish and all these people sending you these stems?
I mean, it's different with every artist and every artist camp and or producers or engineers, right? I mean, you've got artists who do their own work, and then you've got artists who work with what we might consider like commercial engineers, like Servin or these big names where it's like they're institutions, and therefore they have a lot of kind of the way they do things, right? But with the Billie stuff is a great example. I feel so privileged to have had the opportunity to work on those records. They're such talented people. They still to this day some of the best stem deliveries of any project I've ever worked on. Not just the fidelity, but like the organization, the name, dumb stuff like the naming. But it goes a long way, right? It's not like I'm getting a folder full of audio 1.2.4 or whatever, right?
So what makes? I hate to interrupt. What makes like? What's a good tip for?
I feel like you help a lot of people out. Like,
man, so stemming, it's a technical job that needs to get done. But there is some artistry to it. There's some sensitivity to it. Let's take drums, for example. Like, some people think about drums like a single instrument, and some people think about drums like an ensemble of percussion instruments, right? But let's think about the way we process drums. A lot of times we'll do cool like bussing stuff, right? Like, or a parallel distortion or a parallel compressor or a parallel decap, whatever it is you're doing, right? But we all have our little drum stuff. We all do cool drum stuff. We love drums. We're engineers.
Absolutely.
So is there something about all of that special sauce that we're doing that is codependent on each other, right? And if that's true, then those things should probably stay together in order to maintain that identity.
This is my biggest issue, like my biggest thing that rattles my brain, because I'm like, I have certain process, and I'm like, wait.
Do you break the aux? Do you send them the raw?
How do I say continue? But you're on it,
But then you get into something like maybe we're layering string pads, like synth strings, for example. Okay, well, like, maybe there's like 3 or 4 pads that are all kind of doing the same harmonic progression.
Sure.
Like those could stay together. But if there are multiple voices, you know, like a high melody and like a low pad or something like that, they have compositional differences.
Right.
So even though they're both strings, having them separate really enables a creativity on the back end, right? Because it's a different voice. You know, you got this high melody over strings, or maybe it's a staccato, pizzicato thing that's going on.
Right.
If they're compositionally different voices, that if you were to remove or change in any way would affect other voices, then those being discrete stems is of great creative value.
Understood.
Right?
Okay, got you.
Right?
Okay.
So there are like compositional nuances, but maybe you've layered 5 bass synths and the aggregate of that is your bass.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That can be one stem because you're introducing less variables that might create a delta there, right? Like, you know, and you don't really want that. You don't want to compromise. You know, they're all hitting your. I was listening to your piece about stem mix or outboard summing boxes, right?
Yes.
And it's like if you're doing something cool like that, like make sure all of that gets its way into the chain.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
I made an interesting mistake in my early assistant years making stems, which was that I was deactivating tracks.
Oh wow.
Changes your delay compensation. So now your tracks on top of each other aren't lined up because like maybe you had like 5 UAD plugins on one track that's compensating by like 10,000 samples, and then another track that's got nothing on it. And you know, so I'm a big fan of muting when creating that. Now it's going to be different for different people and different DAWs. Yeah. You know, Logic, you can just say go, right?
Right.
But maybe you're on a desk, or maybe you have a summing mixer, or maybe you're got inboard outboard stuff, and you need to actually record your stems.
Yes.
Right. So now it's like, you know, there's annoying little technical things you got to think about, but then there's also like creative compositional based decisions you want to make too, right? And so those are all going to come from understanding how to do a breakout, right? Because if you're doing like a metal band and you just have guitars as a stereo stem, that's really limiting creatively because you probably have like 10 guitars,
right?
You know? Or synths, or what, you know what I mean? It's like what is synths on a Tiesto track? I keep grabbing the same artist out of my mind. I only have so much RAM, you know. But like, you know, what is synths? What does that even mean, right? But it's like, oh, you got your high voices, you got your, you know, percussive voices, you got your impacts, sound effects and stuff. You know, all our stingers and risers, and all that cool little butter that we put in to like take us from A to B, and that goes back into my idea of like, well, composition dictates my decisions in immersive. If you give me that riser and then that stinger that's taking us from the verse to the chorus, that's a great opportunity for movement because that's what you're putting in the composition. And that's not inherent to stereo. That's not inherent to mono. That's emotion, right? We can feel, we got tension and release. We can feel something's coming. Then there's the big drop. Now we're in the chorus, and then that stinger is like, oh, that big moment, right? It feels good, feels great. Like, cool. I'm gonna have that swell from the back and hit the front right when the 808 drops, and then it'll fly over my head. And it's like you don't even almost hear the movement because you're already feeling it.
You're just feeling you're feeling it, right?
Yeah, totally. So, you know, but again, we're talking about this idea of like, how do you transmute a stereo concept into something that doesn't necessarily have to adhere to those limitations. Sometimes things are mono, right? Sometimes things are, you know, not inherently stereo things. So it's just being critical about asking yourself, what elements do I want from this mix that would enable creativity on the, you know, in something I can't even anticipate, right? You know?
So how would you attack? I forget. It was a song in your credits, and it had you as a mixer, but it was from the '80s, and I was like,
"Oh, the Coolin'! It was Coolin' Again. Coolin' Again. Did you did an
like,
old record, which was
immersive.
wild?
Was it immersive?
Yeah, I've done some catalog stuff.
Okay.
So how do you approach those like older
That's
records?
Such a good question. That's such a good question. What's always fascinating to me about that is the difference between the way a mix actually sounds and the way it lives in our minds. That we've lived in it forever.
Wow.
Right.
So a couple of the bigger catalog pieces I've done that I'm really proud of are like Bob Marley stuff, like Legend.
Wow.
Pearl Jam, like the 10 record, and the D'Angelo stuff.
Wow.
And so it's like 3 different artists from 3 different eras that represent very different things, all of which I could walk into any room and most people could sing at least one song by one of those artists, right? So what do you do when something is like lived in the zeitgeist forever? Like, you know, for most of us our entire lives, and for some of us we're seminal on our journey, right? You know, it's like D'Angelo Untitled, that is the sound of 3 a.m. for me for a long time.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like,
Exactly.
and that's a very specific, music is how we decorate our time, right? It's a very
a good way to put it.
critical thing
Right.
that we create so many different types of memories.
Right.
For, right.
Right.
But then you're in the studio and you've got this job to do.
Right.
Right.
So-
You've been given this incredible responsibility.
Right.
You're gonna mix Exodus, again.
Right. Again.
Okay.
Okay.
You're gonna mix Pearl Jam's 10 again.
Right.
Like,
Yes.
Gotcha.
like, first of all, I'm gonna go cry a little bit, and then I'm gonna solo every single track and just like be a student and just like bathe in Pino's bass lines, and Class Screwed, and just like be so humbled by this moment.
Right. Right.
Then I'm gonna get to work.
Right.
Right. And what you often find is, so like I remember when I heard, Even Flow by Pearl Jam the first time, and the way it's lived in my mind is it's like this mix is huge.
Right.
It's big as a house. It's
Right.
like it's massive. And then you're sitting there and you get your big fancy PMCs and you're in your big fancy studio and you listen to it and it's like, well, emotionally, yes. Sonically, maybe not necessarily. Now, no discredit. It's an awesome record.
course.
Sounds
Yeah.
great.
Different time.
But you're like, in my mind,
Right.
this thing lives enormous. And so that's this lesson that I learned is sometimes you have to balance mixing literally to the original expression,
Yes.
but also mixing to the way that music has grown
Right.
when it was no longer the artist's and it became everybody's.
Right.
Right? Like, what do we think of when you think about Bob Marley's Exodus, right?
Right.
You've got some like, those funky cats like scratching on these guitars and these claps. You got these vocalists who are like so perfectly out of
Right.
tune. It's amazing. You would never. There's nothing about wrong in that at all.
Right.
It's so gorgeous. They could not be further behind the beat in the coolest, like just
Way.
sexiest,
Grooviest
grooviest way.
way.
I mean,
Yes.
it's just like you're just sitting there going, yeah,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, cool. Now I need to capture that
Right.
and present it in a new way. You don't want to overlimit yourself because then it's just what we already had.
Right.
Right. It's got to still have purpose.
Right.
Absolutely. Someone's, there's always going to be someone who's like, who are you to be mixing this stuff? Or why did they mix this again? It was
Sure.
perfect. It's perfect on vinyl. Like, you should never
Leave it
touch anything
alone.
like that.
Right.
There's always going to be that.
Yeah.
But guess what? Someone's going to make the call to do it again, and someone's going to get
Absolutely.
that gig.
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
And
Sure.
so when that's you go, okay, well, let's put all that aside
Yeah.
and just figure out what we need to do. And it's like, let's say I listen to this music every day my entire life, what would I want this to be?
Yes.
Right. Right.
What emotion do I want to feel? And it's like, I want to feel those, 10 or 12, however many it is, just real badass musicians
Right.
having that conversation, right? Because it's like, what's so magical about that music? Like, why the piano's hitting when they hit versus the guitar? Like,
Right.
what's the percussionist doing? And like, how is that bass just so thick?
Right.
Right. And so you might listen to the stereo and think to yourself like, oh, okay, like, yeah, it's all there.
Right.
But like, now I'm thinking about being a bass player. I'm thinking about times I've had conversations about music, times I've been in the room and or seen the band play or whatever it is. And it's like, I want to feel that conversation happening with those musicians. I want to feel the tension and release that happens when there's that call and response between, Bob, whose voice is big as a house, and then those three background singers who are just like bringing that, he's calling and then they're responding. And it's like there's a physical interplay that happens there, and it happens because they wrote all that stuff in the room standing there.
Right.
So if I could maybe tap into that energy, maybe I can bring something meaningful to this experience that maybe is a limitation in stereo, but not necessarily in what the canvas I've been given.
Yes.
Right.
And so it's like, it's kind of that combination of, you listen to the records a lot before you start.
Right, you know
what I
them,
mean?
front
And
to
you
back.
and you know them, and
Right.
you just want to, you take, like I said, you take that moment of like crushing responsibility and privilege, and then you express yourself.
Right. And make it happen.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I would say just my biggest fear about Atmos, because as brilliant as let's slow it down, LJ.
Yeah.
My biggest fear about Atmos is that as brilliant as it is, I feel like all right, we're finally, I think, closing in on the phase of adoption as far as not only education for our engineers but also adoption in the music industry to make this or more of a priority to get done as far as getting it mixed in Atmos or any other spatial format. I wonder, what does the next phase to you look like as far as adoption across the masses?
Oh wow.
I mean, that's an amazing question. I could tell you what I think what I would like to see the most.
I think that's what
that was
is
the
the way
best
to answer
I
it.
would ask for. Yeah.
What I would like to see the most is some artist or band or creative, producer or someone with a real just a voice to kick the door open and just make a record naturally in the format and like tell all of us what is actually going on.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because everything I've said up to this point is about how I'm interpreting the stereo to then create a compelling experience. But if you remove that mechanism, that will permanently evolve the way we think about this, right? So I like producers writing in it, right? And of course, cart before the horse stuff, right? And this is where we get into things that aren't nearly as romantic as that sentiment, right? We need viable endpoints, things like I'm not here to hawk for brands, but like Sonos does a great job of creating an accessibility to it, right? We're working really hard, and something that I really love about the job that I have, that I'm continuing to define for myself, is working with cars.
Yes.
Right? Because we all know how sacred the relationship between music and cars is.
Yes.
Right?
Sonos,
I mean, and cars give us a really unique opportunity, right? We know where you're sitting and we know where the speakers are.
Right.
There's a lot of ways in which we can make a really compelling experience.
Right.
And I've learned a ton from these engineers.
I'm
It's
sure.
really interesting stuff. But I digress. As long as if someone's creating a record and it's like that is how it's meant to be heard, that is where the expression takes place, and then the fans get to hear that way. The people who love the music get to hear it that way. Then I think we'll really start evolving what that conversation is like.
Right.
Because there'll be. And I'm not trying to discredit any of like the work I've done, all those hardworking Atmos engineers have done, but there will be an authenticity to the experience that is undeniable, right? Its efficacy will be just purely locked into the fact that this is how the artists express themselves. You think about what artists have done with technology forever, and that is totally flip it on its head. Right? You get, Fender makes the electric guitar and the electric amp, and they say, if it's distorting, turn it down. Well, Jimi Hendrix, right? That's out the window. Right. You get MPCs, right? It's like, cool, you can play drums on this, and it's like, oh, we're sampling. Out the window, whole new art form is born. Turntables are made for playing back records.
Out the window
immediately.
Interesting.
So it's like I want, like, as great as I feel about the work that I've done, and as proud as I've been to be custodian of all these great records, everybody should at least have the opportunity to explore what happens when an artist really just throws the book out the window, and just makes something, right? And I want it to subvert my expectations or exceed my dreams, or I want it to make me think, "Fuck, everything's different now." Sorry, I've been trying to be clean this whole time.
You're good. Don't worry, it's not a family show.
Can I just add a little
sure,
to that?
And make sure you come back to me.
For sure. What's very interesting about that is that it definitely reminded me of this, like the 50 million time I brought this song up, about the Bohemian Rhapsody experience.
Oh, gotcha.
It's literally almost like similar to what you said. It's like at that point, especially when stereo was fresh, hearing a song like that where it's just like, all right, why is Freddie Mercury over here and the rest of the band is doing, all these harmonies on the right? And it's like, well, watch when that song came out and it revolutionized everything. Stereo. So it's almost like treating the new adopted technology, instead of an evolution, treat it as an origin point.
Right. And what I was going to add to was, you made me think of the same thing. I was thinking about origin points, like in just like sonics. And I don't know why, when you said it's going to take an artist to like show us, like, not saying the way, but like, whoa, I never thought about it like that. The first album I thought about was Dark Side of the Moon. First thing I thought about. And I was like, man, like when that album came out, it was such a revolution of sound and just like feeling. And it made me think like, man, if somebody went and said, I'm going to produce and make an album in Immersive, like I know deep down, I probably would go, I want to listen to that. It would make me a little bit more, as opposed to how we think now, where you're saying, I'm literally just translating a stereo like and mix into it. I never thought about it that way.
I think it removes the barrier of choice as well. Like, if you want to experience it, like, you're gonna experience it how it was meant to be interpreted.
Right, because it was created.
Without that choice to say, well, I'd rather stereo. It's like, no, let's, you know what I mean? You're creating the memory of the record with this format. And I think that's one of the barriers I feel like the stereo conversions, for lack of a better word, to Dolby Atmos or whatever, a spatial experience has turned certain people off. It's just like if I hear the songs in A minor record from Alicia in Dolby, it doesn't, because I created this memory with this version, I'm
In stereo.
very quick to maybe dismiss this new mix. You know what I mean?
Right.
Totally. And it could be a brilliant Atmos mix,
Absolutely.
but it's just that you know what you know,
Exactly.
and
Right.
you can never quite, you know what I mean? You can't you can't hear something for the first time again.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So
Right.
like, you know, and it's cool, you know, now we do all these day and date releases, right? So it's like it could be the first time you hear a new record.
Sure.
But it was still written in stereo.
Yeah.
Right.
It was
still conceptualized, and it's, you know, one of the best pieces of feedback I could have and could ever get on an Atmos mix of a record is, this is how it sounded in my head.
Right. Wow.
Right? And it's like, okay, great, like, cool, you were thinking three-dimensionally, and then you were limited by the resources available to you, and maybe I had the privilege of actualizing that for you in a way that, you know, maybe wasn't something that you were thinking of. Well, it was what you were thinking about, but it wasn't attainable to you. Well, imagine that same person had that canvas to begin with. Well, now, like, what does that record sound like? You know, and maybe it's more of what we know, but maybe it's something unknown, you know, or challenging, right? And in the same way that person who heard that Jackson 5 record when it came out in stereo was like challenged by that,
Right.
Look where we are now. It's not like we went back to one speaker,
Sure.
Exactly.
right?
And
Like, you know,
And the funny thing about it is, like, as a, you know, in my age, I've only heard it in stereo. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I grew up and first heard it in stereo. So I think about that now. I say, wow, you know what? Songs in A minor, you know, obviously there's an immersive version, if I'm not mistaken, right? It's an immersive version?
right.
Okay.
I think it won a Grammy.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, man. Oh, yeah, won a Grammy. That's right.
Yeah.
I think about that, like, hey, what 30 years from now, someone's first experience hearing that album is like immersive. You know, like, I never thought about that.
And
like,
I think even further than that, I think something like that develops in a sense of just how the next generation or the generation after, whatever, wherever we're talking about, will perceive music, period. Because it's hard for immediately when you said that, I was thinking, all right, what if I said F it and did a live version of my album, recorded completely in Atmos, only available in Immersive. But in my head, it's hard to interpret how that would look versus a generation of people like I was, only brought up in stereo. I'm not thinking ever mono. I'm only thinking, all right, I could do this with my
I don't even
production
think
and all
in
of
mono.
that. So when you open up that canvas to someone in the future who's only consumed in this big space, how do they fill that up? You know what I mean?
Totally. Well, and, you know, I think you touch on something really critical, which is, you know, where are we in the timeline, and why would we spend so much time thinking about today? When we make music to exist in perpetuity.
Wow.
And what is it that, you know, Atmos represents outside of the creative opportunities, right? Music went from the biggest thing music did was go from mono to stereo, and then we explored 5.1, but it wasn't that.
Just didn't,
and there are some amazing 5.1 album mixes that we've
Absolutely.
all heard, but let's be honest, that wasn't the revolution. You know, and then the other thing we did was we went to digital. Right. I don't mean not tape necessarily. But I mean, we're not buying CDs. Right. Yeah, we're buying vinyl, and I have a record player, and I love vinyl and all of that. That's that could be a whole different hour of talking about stuff. But virtual three-dimensional, which is really what Atmos is, right? We talk about 916, 714, whatever. It's virtual three-dimensional. Well, this is the first time in a long time that we're actually moving with all of our other consumed media. I mean, television and film, you know, sports broadcasting. I mean, podcasts now, like, there's a lot, you know, it's all because the delivery system is the same, right? It's not like, oh, you need to get the Blu-ray or you need to get the CD or the Super HD. It's like, no, we're just the internet connection. Right. And so it's like, well, now, like, we're participating in that, right? There is space in the container for us to be uninhibitedly creative, and also be right there with our records,
everyone else.
You know, you know, Barbie is in Atmos. I did the "What Was I Made For" single.
Oh wow, that's awesome!
And he murdered it.
We talk about that all the time. That's so funny. Yeah,
and
that's awesome.
That was my initial example of hearing for the first, like, because the first NAMM I went to, everyone had the Atmos room,
Yeah.
and we were hearing the bass just spin and make us dizzy.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
So
Cool for 5 minutes, and then I'm seasick, and I'm ready to.
Yeah, I'm like, hey, no more. I'm cool.
Yeah.
Like,
And that was the first mix I heard where everything felt calm and felt like, wow, I'm in a room.
Right.
Versus
Right.
I'm in an experience.
Right.
And what you just said about just the timeline brought me to, I don't know why, it made me think of, I feel like this is the only time in history, maybe not the only, but the earliest time in history where we'd be able to think that big with Dolby for the simple fact of delivery. Because my mind goes to, I don't remember what, I think the 80s maybe or the 90s. I think RCA. Don't get me, like, if I'm wrong, whatever. I think RCA attempted to make this before compact discs. They wanted to make a vinyl for video, but they struggled because it was, imagine the disc. Vinyl is made of
Laser disc.
oh my God, I remember that.
My father
I think it was
had
like a
a few of
vinyl
them.
record.
Sure. Yeah.
I think it was
Huge.
actual a vinyl record for video, but that
It was big.
Think
It
about
was
the
huge.
bumps and all of that, like how audio is printed onto vinyl. Now think about trying to import colors and movement and all of these visual aspects on this piece.
Right.
Now that makes me think of Atmos in a sense, or just immersion, and how would maybe that fit, or would we be able to think that big from back then, whether on a cassette tape, all of that information, work on a CD? Like, we barely had space on a CD for too many records, vinyl records. So, wow, that kind of opens my mind up to that
so
time
much,
completely.
so much stuff. And with that being said, Nick, like round of applause for Nick.
No, for real. This
real talk. It was. I feel like I'm so happy we got into that because I feel like that's something that we talk. I don't want to say blindly about, but
No, blind. I'd say blindly and not ignorantly. I do that because it's kind of a harsh word.
Yeah.
But I think it's the biggest thing in every community, but especially this community, is just conversation. Access to conversation. I feel like a lot of people, to a lot of people, this is just something that we're being sold on, and then you know what I mean. We don't think that big a lot. You know what I mean? And it takes conversation from people like you, which I didn't know this would happen.
I didn't know.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And I would have just went around my day like, they should just bring a new format on us. They're trying to this and that.
Right.
But what's this? And all of these questions, but perspective.
I think this conversation, I think, is going to give a ton of perspective to people that are like, not saying one foot out, 1 foot in with Atmos and Immersive, but more or less just like, hey, what is this thing? Where did it come from? And then just get the perspective of like thinking about it in reference to like stereo and how that was like. You're so right. When you like, one of my biggest things, Zaire, make sure you clip this up too, by the way, is when you said, people complained and was like, what is this stereo thing when it first came out? Like same thing. And I'm like, you're absolutely right. Or the part where we talked about, some kid is probably going to only hear
I was about to say
these songs in
the
Atmos
important takeaway is to, I think for everyone learning it right now, is taking away that even for the developers, for the people that mix in it, it's still a mystery in the sense of how it's going to land and sit with us forever.
And even the creation aspect, like kind of piggybacking off of the
goodness,
the vinyl. You know what I mean? We just didn't have the capacity. Now we're thinking, we finally made it. All the computers are overpowered for what we need in Pro Tools. And we're thinking fucking 128 gigs of RAM is just, we're good at 64. We finally hit the peak.
Right.
But we have no idea.
We're just going to keep going and
just
keep
started.
going.
There's
no
always
idea.
something else.
Oh, yeah,
You can't
for sure.
stop technology.
Of course. So, Nick, I just want to say thank you so much for the information, man. Like,
That was
seriously,
amazing.
man. Like, real talk. Like, everybody on our fans know, like, we've been, like, looking for, like, really looking to have, like, a real, like, Atmos conversation. Our conversation with Atmos has been very surfaced, of course, but it's just good to have somebody that was, like, around for its conception for the most part, you know what I mean? And just seeing what it's really grown into and just, obviously giving me a history lesson on that and stuff like that.
Honestly.
The biggest line,
Thank you.
one of the greatest lines that shifted my perspective that you said was, it's I don't know why we're thinking of the now when we create for our
Perpetuity.
music to live in perpetuity.
Perpetuity. Can I tell you what he said? You dropped a few gems. Just like
I ain't gonna-
you know my favorite gem he said? I ain't gonna lie. Can I say this? Hold on. We've never done like a recap. Like, yo, so there's he said this. One thing you said, and I never heard nobody say this, and credit to whoever did, but you bringing this to my attention, so you said it in my opinion. When you said we use music to decorate our time. Like,
Yeah.
That's a thought.
that hit me just now. It's like, you so right, because when it comes to even just my own music, I can tell you what year it was depending on the album.
Yes.
I'm like, oh, that was 2019 or that was 2018. That's the only way I could do it. So once again, thank you so much, Nick, for the information and stuff like
this was
that.
And
incredible,
thank you
man.
for that
Yeah.
Billie Eilish immersive mix.
Yeah, facts.
goodness.
Yeah, that's
I'm
one of
my
those
privilege.
ones. Heck yeah.
No, thank y'all for having me.
Of course.
And
of course.
I'm not gonna lie, the stemming information too, because
I wanted that. Like, these are all questions.
we think of this. I hate the recap, but we always think of. I've always been taught like this is the way to do steps.
Right.
You have to separate everything. But what you said about like if these pieces need each other to make sense, why not keep it together? I'm like,
Right. I'm like, thank you. That makes so much sense. But
thank you so much.
anyway, sorry to give you the cliff notes of the whole thing and the whole nine, but sorry, that was really inspiring. I'm gonna be honest with you.
Absolutely,
That was really inspiring.
man.
I'm gonna take us out. Please make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. Remember, one lucky person in the comment section is gonna get that VIP Gold Edition Rosetta EQ or compressor. And remember, our members saw this video, so
Absolutely.
you can become a member and get exclusive content as well as early access to video and even money in the store, etc. So again, Nick, thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Where can people find
Where can we
you?
find
If
you?
wanna be
Yeah,
found?
right. Like, yeah, right. Where can people ask you these questions? Because they're gonna be like, "Hey, Nick, question." Like
Yeah.
on my renderer. Where can people find you for the most part?
Instagram.
Gotcha. What's your Instagram at?
It's just @ Nick Reeves.
Say less.
Yeah.
And I'll make sure there's a link in the description
Yeah.
below.
Yeah.
Don't bother him too much, y'all. But he'll be there. But we'll take us out and thank you so much. And until next time, y'all.
And remember, sometimes that hi-hat can live with the bongos.